So we have cleaned up the weird protruding parts near that section of the building. Now let's try to extract this as a separate object and work on it as a separate object. I switched over to the material preview mode just to check out how it looks with the more defined texture, and allow me to use the annotation to quickly show the portion of the mesh that I would like to see extracted and that I would want to work on until it's a separate modular asset that we can use in our, say, world building attempts. So imagine that we would want to turn this surface into a waterproof mesh somehow, which has not only the front side, but also the back side and so on and so forth. What we can do first is switch over to the solid shading mode to make the selection process faster. And once again, enter the sculpting mode, select mask. I don't like the smooth fall-off here. So within the fall-off tab, let's select the constant one, which I think makes much more sense in this context. Let's go ahead and start masking out this part of the wall. I think I will enable the vertex color from within the viewport settings to serve as a reference for our masking work. It will be much easier to do it this way. And so I'm laying out the lazy brush strokes here and there. You can be pretty loose with defining the mesh borders. It's useful to preview the mesh without any colorization from time to time to see if we are still masking it out correctly. So yeah, the difficulty here can be in telling where one part of the object transitions into the other part. For example, where the wall meets the other surface which is behind it. But with some practice and with a sufficient number of polygons available, it's totally manageable. Then from within the masking menu, I'm selecting Mask Extract. I'm going to leave all the options at their default values except the Extract as Solid. I'm disabling it. I don't want the Solidify modifier to be applied automatically. After pressing OK, we can see that we have a new mesh in our scene. We have just extracted it. Let's organize the scene collections a little bit. The original one, I called it Proxy, and then I'm pressing M with this object selected, and I'm moving it to the new collection called Retopo. Just bear with me, I will be naming things like this from time to time, mainly to show the milestones of the workflow. So from Proxy, we moved on to the Retopo. Next, we will try to regenerate the backside of this object and make it solid. So there are a few ways of making the object manifold. Let's have a look at the most obvious one in this case, where you have the front surface of the object and a little bit of the sides. But first, I'm gonna delete the stray vertices. It's usually a good idea to do that right away, as they can mangle some modifiers. So I have deleted those vertices. Now back into the object mode. We were talking about the way to make the object solid if it has the nice front surface and a little bit of the size and is symmetrical, that is mirror. In order to mirror it along a certain point in space, I created an empty object. Then I'm selecting this one, heading over to the modifiers tab and selecting mirror. Okay, now we have a digital double of this object. We just have to snap it into place somehow. The empty object that we have just created will come in handy in this case, because by default, without any empties, the object is mirrored around its origin point. And the rotation of the object also plays the role in it. It's much easier to select the empty and use the transform of this empty to drive the mirror modifier instead. Based on the orientation of the empty, the mirroring axis should be set to X. Now press G to move it and R to rotate. And I'm trying to build a solid object out of these two. The problem is that we have inevitable self-intersections, but thankfully there is an easy fix. First, toggle the bisect on the X-axis and then flip it like this. the bisect works its magic. We just have to make sure that the width of the wall is more or less even, and that's easier to be said than done. What I can say, it's a matter of trial and error. Thankfully, it's not a destructive modifier, so you can definitely roll back if the result is not what you think will work best here. I even try to nail the rotation of the empty object from within the orthographic perspective. What I'm trying to achieve with all these manipulations is A, an even thickness of the wall, and B, the pattern of the bricks that doesn't look absurd. Now, after we have solidified the object partially with the help of the mirror modifier, the question is how to fill the gaps. Because at the top and at the bottom of the mesh, there are two glaring gaps that need to be filled in with some material, but how? First of all, the sorting out routine to put the mirror inside the retopo collection, stuff like that. Then I'm going to start filling in the object with something. Let's say with cubes, or with one cube. I'm scaling up the object so it encompasses this empty space at the top of the wall. I imagine this being some sort of a digital clay, and this association will become even stronger once we start using sculpting with dynamic topology in just a moment. But for now, I'm loosely hammering this object into place. This workflow that we're poking with the stick right now is one of the chill out ones. It is very freeform. Now let's enter the sculpting mode, but let's go back to the object mode instead and hit Ctrl A and apply the scale. It's important to have the scaling of the object applied before sculpting it. That's the iron law of sculpting. Back to the sculpting mode, let's turn on the dynamic topology. With dynamic topology turned on, the polygons will be generated on the fly. Maybe the detail size should be lower. So the point here with the dynamic topology used in this context is to fill in the empty space in between the cubic object that we have just added and the wall edges. So at this stage, my association with the digital clay becomes really prominent. I think that's a really descriptive way to talk about this process. What we're doing here, we're trying to nudge the digital clay into place so the visually, at least the visually, the two objects become one. This, let's say, seamless transition between these two objects is a must-have, as we are going to be using the remesh modifier a bit later on. In other words, it will ultimately get merged together in just a minute. That's why we need to care about the connection and how it looks. After creating a lump of digital clay, I'm selecting the scrape brush in order to flatten some sections out so it doesn't look like it's made of sand or something like that, so it still has some sharpness. Of course, on the other hand, it depends on the material that we have in mind. Maybe the top of the object can be covered in some substance like, I don't know, a moss or snow or whatever it can be. Then it could make sense to make it a little bit bulgy. But anyway, I'm gonna copy this object by pressing Shift D, scale it down by pressing S, then nudge it into place like this, maybe push it up. Somehow it fits almost instantly, which is a good thing to save some time. Back into the sculpting mode, let's enable the dynamic topology once again. You can find it actually in this menu as well. There are the sculpting options there. Let's carefully adjust this object until it forms a nice continuation of the wall. There is no need to be extra precise with it, but it's still, how should I put it, it's still nice to create an illusion that this is a singular mesh. It will come in handy during remeshing. By this stage of the workflow, we should be perfectly ready to press the remesh button in Blender. or rather use the mesh modifier. But first let's do a few things to get a clean result. I'm going to select these two extra objects, then shift-click on the wall. It is marked in bright orange, meaning that it is an active object, and we can copy the modifiers from the active object by pressing Ctrl+C and select Copy Modifiers, and then define the ones that you want to copy. There is only one, so it's pretty easy. We have copied the mirror modifier to everything now, and by doing that, we ensured that everything is perfectly symmetrical. It isn't strictly required to do that, but if you want to keep everything crystal clean, it makes sense. Now I'm gonna select everything, with having the wall as the last object that is selected. Right-click, Join. From now on, this will be a singular object, and all its elements will share all the happy and sad moments and all the modifiers. To keep the trend of transparent workflow going, I'm going to duplicate this object by pressing Shift-D and then M to move it to new collection. I'm going to call this collection Remesh, and everything that relates to remeshing operations will happen to this iteration of the model. So with this model selected, I'm going to go over to the Modifiers tab and add in the Remesh modifier. That's how we're going to remesh our thing, with using the voxel remesher to be exact. Alternatively, you can do it from the Object Properties tab, the Remesh panel. It has not only the voxel mode, but also the quad mode. The main reason for not using the quad mode is that it won't necessarily result in a watertight mesh, whereas voxel mesh will ensure it. Also, there's a lot of trial and error going back and forth with the results when working from the mesh data panel, whereas the modifier we can see the changes the settings have to the mesh in real time. So in conclusion, quad remesh will work on a non-manifold stuff, and voxel remesh keeps it watertight. Even a plane becomes a flattened cube. And anyway, I'd recommend using the modifier version of the remesh because it's great for real-time viewing. The tricky part is to choose the appropriate voxel size to find a happy medium, because if you set it too low, it will disintegrate. If you set it too high, it won't be able to capture the object shape sufficiently. In this case, I think something like 0.04 meters or maybe slightly lower value will be quite enough to capture the big and medium frequency traits of this shape. Alright, we also have the adaptivity slider. It could have been useful if it was the last destination of our journey, the final iteration of this wall or something, and we didn't have to further push the polygons or anything. But as this is not the case, definitely, I'm gonna leave the adaptivity at its default value, which is 0. Then I will keep adjusting the voxel size until it looks to me like I have hit the happy medium. And by the way, if you want to check wireframes like I do, you can do it from the viewport settings menu, or you can assign a special shortcut for it. For example, a semicolon. But hey, we have just made a singular object, a singular unit.